My cat chose me. People always say stuff like that, and it's kind of weird. They say things like, I went to the shelter today and this kitty wouldn't stop meowing at me. That's how I knew she wanted me. Whatever you say, Susanne. My cat actually chose me. He made a decision. See, he was my cat to begin with. In the beginning, he belonged to Mr. Lysette from down the street. That lasted for a great many years. Until, that is, Mr. Lysette was found dead in his home. He didn't have much in the way of family, so it was a few days before anyone found him. I'm told it was quite a sight to see. I didn't care to find out any more than that. Death seems sort of personal to me. Knowing about someone's death is intimate. And he and I didn't share that kind of intimacy. He was just a nice old man who lived down the street. A nice old man with a very weird cat. I think Animal Control tried to pick the cat up, rehome it. Edward, that's the name I gave him, was having none of it. I saw an Animal Control officer arrive at the house before I left for work one morning. When I came back that afternoon, he was gone. And the cat was sitting on the fence post, watching traffic. No one ever came back for Edward. But how did I end up with him? I know that's what you're thinking. Edward sat on that very fence post for several weeks, watching the world pass by in front of him. Every single person that traversed our street did so under Edward's watchful eye. Occasionally he would leap down from his perch and inspect a passerby. Nobody, however, was allowed to pet him. If he tried, he'd scamper away, hiding in some underbrush and growling loudly. It was hilarious and fun to watch, if a little bit strange. However, Edward's attention soon shifted to none other than yours truly. It started one day when I was walking by Mr. Lysette's old house, which was now, for all intents and purposes, solely Edward's domain. I can't remember what I was supposed to be doing, because I was stopped by Edward, placing himself in my path and staring at me. It made me a little uncomfortable, actually. Edward had this really piercing stare. His green eyes are sharp, cold, and undeniably intelligent. And they were directed at me. Okay. I considered walking around him, but Edward stalked forward before I had made up my mind. I held still as he sniffed my legs and wound about my feet, sizing me up. This went on for at least 5 minutes, during which I didn't move at all. You don't agitate a strange creature, even if you're reasonably sure it has all its shots. Once Edward was done with his inspection, he licked his lips, sat in front of me, and meowed. And that, I think, is when he made his choice. Over the next few days, Edward migrated from his original post to a new perch, right in front of my house. Every morning when I left for work, he was there, sunning himself in my front yard, his black tail twitching back and forth. When I came home at night, he was sitting at my front door. At first, I was careful to make sure he didn't try to get inside. I had no desire to own a pet at that point in my life. But I relaxed when I realized that he had no intentions of trying to invade my personal space. Instead, he would rub his cheek against my leg as I unlocked the door, and then settle down for the night, sleeping on my doorstep. A few weeks passed in just that way. And then one day, I bought a bag of cat food. I didn't do anything with it for a few days, but I'm sure Edward noticed when I locked it into my house. A week later, I left a bowl of cat food on the doorstep. I came home to see the food gone, and Edward curled around the bowl, purring lightly as he slept. I couldn't stand it anymore. That little bastard had won over my heart. Sighing, I picked him up, carried him inside. If he woke up, he didn't show it. He simply curled further into my arms. I took him right into my room and let him sleep on my bed. When I woke up the next morning, Edward was tucked under my chin, purring and nosing along my neck. I shifted back to look at him, amused. I had never seen him be friendly with anyone but me. We stared at each other for a few moments. Then he leaned forward and swiped his paw against my nose. He whined at me, and even I understood the universal sound of "feed me, I'm hungry." I laughed and Edward's expression darkened. He growled lightly in his throat and crouched as though to pounce me. I yelped and practically jumped out of bed to find his food. He burrowed himself back under the covers, as though happy with his display of dominance. Note to self, I thought as I grabbed his food bowl from the doorstep and brought it inside. That sound means, "Feed me, I'm hungry and bitchy." Over the next few months, Edward and I grew ever closer. So much so that I soon couldn't remember how I lived my life without him. He was there every morning when I went to work and greeted me every night when I came home. He cuddled close to me every night when I slept and wouldn't leave my side when I was sick. When I was down, he'd tangle his paws into my long hair until I laughed and felt better. Hell, he even listened to me when I bitched about my day, and he'd meow and hiss when it seemed appropriate to the conversation. He really is a smart bastard. But more than that, he's my bastard. Edward is a great cat. And it didn't take me long to realize that he's also a bit of an odd cat. For one, I stopped buying cat food pretty quick. Edward would eat it, but he made it very clear that it wasn't his top choice. He preferred meat. Just a little bit of raw beef would make him a very happy Edward indeed. Sure, it was a bit more expensive, feeding him meat all the time, but at the end of the day, I didn't really mind, so long he was happy. It's weird how someone can wriggle their way into your life and become such an integral part of your existence that you'd be willing to do anything for them. Additionally, Edward is a very prolific hunter, but he's never shared his kills with me. I know he's massacred a hell of a lot of birds based on the bones and bloody feathers I've found in my backyard, but he's never found it fit to share with me. Somehow I know he's not trying to be considerate of my distaste for bird carcasses. Rather, he hunts for himself. And fuck you if you aren't a good enough hunter. Get your own food. He's got a hell of an attitude, and I love that about him. Of course, for the first few months together, I didn't realize how strange Edward actually was. It wasn't until my home was violated in the middle of June that I got an inkling of how unique he really is. I always lock my door. Yes, it's true that I live in a neighborhood that's known for being pretty safe. So why bother? Because I'm not an idiot. If you leave your door open, you are objectively dumb. And you deserve the robber that breaks into your house and smothers you in your sleep. I, on the other hand, absolutely did not deserve to have a robber break into my house. But life isn't fair, and for whatever reason, Robber McDoucheface decided that my house was as good as any. I woke up one night to a sound from downstairs. I knew I hadn't dreamt it because Edward was on high alert, his ears twitching and his green eyes shining in the moonlight. I stood up and grabbed the baseball bat I keep near my bed in case of emergencies or unexpected baseballs crashing through my bedroom window, of course, and crept down the stairs. Edward followed behind me, hidden in my shadow as I tried to reassure myself that nothing was wrong. The robber was rummaging through my writing desk, blocking my way to the front door. He was throwing papers of my latest manuscript across the floor, searching for... fuck if I know. I'm not exactly rich, and I don't have anything in my house worth taking. Unless he was planning on harvesting my organs or something. I considered creeping back up the stairs, locking the door to my room and calling the police. but he saw me before I had the chance. We froze, staring at each other. I was dismayed because the fucking idiot wasn't even wearing a mask, which did not bode well for my chances of survival. He had a puffy sort of face, almost like he had some kind of weird infection, and dirty blonde hair that was so greasy it was practically glued to his scalp. He was a big guy, but he was pretty out of shape. I thought I might be able to take him out, but unfortunately, we were unmatched in another, more important regard. I had a pet, but he had a gun, and that gun was trained on me.
What the fuck are you doing?
I don't know why, the answer was obvious. I think maybe I just needed something to say. The staircase didn't provide enough cover for me to outrun him back up the stairs, unless he was a terrible shot, but I couldn't depend on that. The dumbass's mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish out of water. Finally, his mouth set in a grim line. He deigned to give me a response.
You shouldn't have got out of bed.
My heart dropped into the pit of my stomach as he cocked his gun. I knew with a terrible certainty that I was going to die. I was so preoccupied with preparing my impending doom that I completely ignored what was happening behind me. That is, of course, until I heard a growl. It had to be Edward. There was no other animals in the house, but I'd never heard him growl like that. It was so deep and loud that for some reason I wondered if there was a goddamn mountain lion behind me.
What the fuck?
That came from the burglar as he shifted his gun to point at something just behind me. Confused, I turned around, just in time to see Edward become something else. It's hard to explain exactly how it happened. One moment, my black cat sat behind me, furious eyes blazing and throbbing with hatred. The next moment, he was obscured in a cloud of black haze. I couldn't see much of anything, but I could hear strange creaking and tearing noises, as though something was being ripped asunder and put back together. I stumbled backwards, almost bumping into the robber who no longer had eyes for me. He and I stood side by side, both watching as it stepped out of the haze. What was it that stepped towards us? I can't say. It sure as fuck wasn't a cat. At least not any cat that I've seen before. It was about the size of a man, but its body was distinctly beastly. It prowled forward on 4 legs, its torso long and lean and very, very strong. Its body was covered with a smattering short black hair, sparse and patchy, such that I could see its gleaming white skin underneath. Its face looked a little smashed. Its eyes were strangely far apart. Its nose was flat against its face, but for the flare of its nostrils, 2 long fangs hung down below its fat lips. The strangest of all, though, were the ears and tail. 2 long ears perked up on its head, covered with scraggly fur, and a long black tail stood straight on edge, protruding from just beneath its tailbone. The growl continued to roar in its throat, and I gasped as I realized that I knew those eyes. The creature in front of us was none other than Edward. Yes, it was clear that he wasn't a cat anymore, but as he stalked forward, I couldn't help but think his movements were distinctly feline. Edward leaned back. His back curved down, and I knew he was preparing to pounce. I stumbled away from the burglar, just in time as Edward took to the air. The robber's gun went off, missing its mark and leaving a bullet hole in the wall. Edward's eyes blazed in the flash of light, and for a moment I swore I saw hell in their depths. Edward collided with the burglar and sent him sprawling to the floor. His new form was massive. If he were to stand on his hind legs, Edward would have been at least 7 feet tall. He had no problem taking down my unwanted guest. The burglar screamed and fought for a few seconds as Edward held him down, considering. He still retained his paws, pressing down on the man's body and almost crushing his torso under the creature's great weight. Eventually, Edward grew bored of the man struggling and leaned his terrible face down to the man's neck. The sound of Edward ripping out the man's throat is something I'll never forget. Nor will I forget the sound of that long, flat tongue lapping up the blood that gushed out of his artery. I think I might have gone into shock after that. I'm not fully sure, as I don't remember a lot of what happened after the robber was hunted. All I remember is bits and pieces. Mostly the robber's bits and pieces, as Edward consumed him over the course of the next several hours. Eventually, all that was left was a blood-soaked carpet and a skeleton that had been picked clean. Edward had eaten even his entrails and internal organs. It was almost considerate of him. It certainly made the cleanup a lot easier, but at the time, that wasn't the first thought crossing my mind. Once Edward had finished his meal, he sat on his haunches and stared at me. He seemed to be sizing me up, considering. Eventually, he walked towards me with all the grace he had shown as a cat, and I was left wondering exactly what this thing was. It sat in front of where I'd collapsed against the wall and watched me for another moment before speaking.
Michael.
I shuddered. Its voice. God. Its voice was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was low and raspy and distinctly animal. It's the voice I used to hear in my nightmare when I was a kid. A voice that came from some primal terror that nobody wants to examine too closely.
I don't intend to hurt you, Michael,
said Edward. He lifted his paw to his mouth, cleaning off a few errant specks of blood. I could see the white skin again through the fur, and I wondered, perhaps, it wasn't skin after all, but bone. You don't? I almost didn't want to ask, but I had to say something. That's probably my worst quality. I have to open my goddamn mouth when I should keep it closed. Edward shook his head and continued.
You're a good master, Michael. I like living here very much. Even better than I like that old man Lyset.
I felt like I was going to faint when I considered Mr. Lyset's death. The state of his body that everyone had been talking about for days. Edward noticed my expression and shrugged.
He was a good master, but I was hungry, and meat is meat. You know that, don't you, Michael?
I nodded and Edward seemed pleased with my answer. He stopped grooming himself and came closer to me, rubbing his cheek against my shoulder. I took great pains to stop myself from flinching. I wasn't out of the woods yet. Edward paused for a moment, seemed to consider something, and continued.
And you don't want to be meat, do you, Michael?
Well, that was easy enough to answer. I shook my head so hard my hair whipped into my face and blinded me for a moment. Edward chuckled, a low, throaty noise, and licked my cheek.
I didn't think so.
By the time I had removed my hair from my face, the haze was back, and Edward was enveloped in it, out of my sight. I held my breath until the cloud dissipated, and my cat was back, staring at me with those large green eyes that were anything but innocent. Edward is a good cat. It took a little getting used to, you see. After all, you don't see something like that every day. But it became clear pretty quickly that Edward didn't mean to cause me any harm. He still curled up next to me while I slept and watched over me when I was sick. He still took great pains to make sure I was happy and safe. In turn, I fed him. Good food, the best I could find. Fine cuts of meat that cost damn near a fortune, but it was worth it. Watching him devour them hungrily and knowing that it wasn't me he had set his eyes on. But lately, I've become a little worried. Because once in a while, I'll catch Edward staring at me with a strange glint in his eyes. A look that makes me think of tigers and panthers. Predators. Sometimes he watches me. Sometimes he licks his lips. And sometimes I wonder if perhaps he is craving a different kind of meat after all.